War is the rule and peace is the exception. When said another way, extinction is the rule and survival is the exception. There never has been a time of such relative peace and stability as the last 80 years. Up until this point, the human experience was mostly characterized by strife, uncertainty, and conflict. Suffice it to say, we are living in exceptionally good times, but this is absolutely not the norm. The law of entropy suggests that societies, like natural systems, tend to evolve towards states of higher disorder or instability if they're not actively maintained, governed, or guided. And it's safe to say, regardless of your political inclinations, that most people would agree that our society is not being properly governed. For this reason, it, like every other empire that came before it, is destined to collapse. It's not a question of if this will happen, simply a matter of when. Thomas Malthus, the 19th century English economist, postulated that population growth will inevitably outpace agricultural production, and that this would lead to famine, war, poverty, and depopulation. Critics of the Malthusian catastrophe often suggest that systems are more adaptive and resilient than Malthus gave them credit for. An example of this would be the Green Revolution, that's seen the population of the planet nearly quadruple. Now, while it may be true that advances in technology, new energy sources, and demographic shifts may arise to postpone this Malthusian collapse scenario, there is something present today that wasn't during the time of Malthus, and it was impossible to foresee. And that is the myriad man-made existential threats that only emerged after Malthus's time. Humankind is currently and inexorably hurtling towards numerous tipping points. I refer to these as the 10 C's. The first thing is conflict. Thomas could not have foreseen the power of nuclear weapons and the capability for us to destroy our civilization many times over. Number 2 is climactic shifts. During the time of Malthus, he could not have possibly foreseen the magnitude and extent to which human beings would have a detrimental impact on their habitat. Number 3 is one that Malthus was fixated on, and that's commodities, energy, and resource scarcity. A tipping point that's most certainly been breached. Eventually, on a finite planet, you're going to run out of stuff. Number 4 is cybersecurity threats. With the trillions of connected devices and trillions more going online every year, our society is more reliant on technology than ever before. This creates a greater attack surface, more vulnerabilities, and more vectors to bring down the entire system as a whole. This next one needs no introduction, and that's the threat of contagion. In the modern day, we are more susceptible to a widespread pandemic than ever before. This is due to a much larger population that is more interconnected than ever before through globalization. During the time of Malthus, before aviation was invented, it took much longer for a contagion to spread. Nowadays, within the span of 24 hours, a contagion can spread across the planet. Next is a threat of commerce and the collapse of the global financial system. Much like the threat of global contagion, the risk of financial crisis is something unique to the 20th century and beyond. With the advent of global reserve currencies, fractional reserve banking, and a digital banking system, which is now tethered to an international system of both labor and commodities, we're at greater risk for a global financial crisis than ever before in history. Up next is censorship, or the crackdown. As times become more austere, there are methods of government control that Malthus couldn't have ever imagined. This is what some people call turnkey totalitarianism. The fact that everything we do now can be monitored and regulated. A power that the kings of old could only have dreamed of. Next is civil unrest. Right now, we're seeing greater degrees of polarization than we've ever experienced before. With growing distrust in governments and institutions, this is bringing us to the brink of civil disorder. Next is citizenship. As we witness this economic contraction, and as conflict and climate issues mount, this contributes to a greater immigration crisis around the world. This feeds in to civil unrest. Lastly, cybernetics covers the risk of artificial intelligence, bioengineering threats, and invasive technologies. All of these things did not exist during the time of Malthus. Historically, human beings endured a cycle of feasts and famines. It was typically either one or the other. In the modern day, however, and in the last 80 years in particular, the better part of the world has only known feast. Thanks to cheap energy, globalization, knowledge and technology, we've been able to support a population that's nearly 800% larger than it was during the time of Malthus, with each person consuming nearly 5 to 10 times as much energy. In order to sustain this 800% increase in population, systems necessarily had to become more centralized and people had to move to the cities. This led to large concentrations of urbanized people who became fully dependent on what's now referred to as the just-in-time delivery system. Now, the just-in-time delivery system increased efficiency because it diminished the amount of inventory stores needed to hold on hand. Now, this is great when everything is working properly, but it's absolutely terrible when things go wrong. What's more is that this complex urbanized reality requires an individual to possess a high degree of specialization in order to prosper. Our anachronistic, pre-industrial skill sets have eluded natural selection and all but atrophied. This means that most of these people couldn't light a fire, hunt their own food, or build their own shelter if their lives depended on it. Any disaster that sees a reversion to these pre-industrial energy levels, we will necessarily see a mass reduction in human population. In creating what we thought was a more efficient and centralized system, it's actually become more vulnerable and less resilient. This intricate network of overlapping critical infrastructures that sustain life, finely woven by modern society, is susceptible to a variety of cascading vulnerabilities. For example, the domino geometric effect is a principle in mathematics wherein a domino can knock over one that is 1.5 times larger than itself. Now, the rate of expansion of this cascading reaction grows exponentially. In principle, this means that one normal-sized little domino can topple one the size of the Empire State Building after a series of only 29 dominoes. Now granted, I know what you're thinking. This is an oversimplified explanation and it doesn't factor in how dynamic and resilient our critical infrastructures are, but it does illustrate how small failures throughout the system can potentially initiate widespread destruction. So knowing all this, the question is, why don't people prepare? The truth is, people simply don't have to think strategically anymore. Think about this for a second. Technology has permitted us to be cognitively lazy, so we no longer have to think that many moves ahead. So our ability for foresight becomes underused and slowly erodes and deteriorates. For example, there was a time when you had to prepare for winter. You had to mentally plan ahead. You had to remember things. You had to be worried about the dangers in the environment because there was no 911. You had to have a sense of direction and route finding because there was no GPS. And you had to be more physically fit. You don't even need to know how to invest your money anymore because someone more specialized than you can manage it. Because we no longer have to do these things, these skills and capabilities have atrophied. At the same time, however, people have developed a physiology that is suited and adapted to navigate the exceptionally complex digital environment, albeit in a cursory manner, a mile wide and an inch deep. So what you're left with is people who have an inability to see the risks that are beyond their line of sight. So this is where the fundamental problem lies. You see, urbanization is inversely correlated with our primitive survival skills. The more urbanized you are, the less survival skills you need. This is great in the best of times, but while the risk factors begin to mount all around us, this becomes exceptionally problematic. As humans, we struggle with what's called generational exceptionalism. We think that our generation is an exception to the rule, and that we're smarter than every other generation that came before us. This is because we've confused the evolution of our institutions with the evolution of human nature. But here's the scary part. People haven't biologically changed in thousands of years. we are prone to the same biological limitations of human nature as previous generations thousands of years ago. But these primal shortcomings are cosmetically concealed by the many layers of technology that we surround ourselves with. We truly think we are an exception to the rule. The American biologist Edward O. Wilson said something incredibly profound. He said that human beings have primal emotions, we live under medieval institutions, and we have godlike technology. The fact is, billions of urbanized humans today are less mentally and physically resilient than their predecessors due to the atrophy of their instincts caused by this dependence on technology. You can take a person from tens of thousands of years ago, put them in a classroom, indoctrinate them, and integrate them into society. People have not fundamentally changed, and this is a terrifying thought when you know what human beings were capable of throughout history. You think we're truly evolved? Well, look at dance parties. Take, for example, a modern music festival. What is the difference between a modern rave and a tribe dancing around a campfire? The answer is nothing whatsoever. We are fundamentally, biologically, the exact same beings as we were 10,000 years ago. The only difference is that now we've replaced the fire pit with neon glowing lights. But hold on for a sec. What about the argument that people have been warning about the apocalypse for thousands of years? Impending doom and eschatology has been present in every generation that's come before us. What is so different about this point in time? Well, the difference is now we actually have the ability to destroy ourselves. Thousands of years ago, most of the threats were exogenous. Nowadays, our existential threats are endogenous, meaning that we cause them. Now, there have been some people in our society who haven't been subdued by the trappings of modernity. Preppers, as we're called, are one group of people who are intuitively aware of the risk factors that we face as a society. So how is it that preppers are different from other people? How do we get the motivation to prepare? The fact of the matter is, if people are not afraid, they simply will not prepare. Fear needs to be there in order for somebody to feel the need to prepare for anything in life, especially the threats that are more abstract and beyond our immediate line of sight. Fear is the most fundamental and essential of all emotions, and it's gotten a bad rap. For example, do you want a job? Well, you first have to fear being poor and dying of starvation because you can't buy enough food to eat. Do you want a partner in life? Well, you must first fear being alone. Do you want to stay healthy? Well, you must first fear becoming physically debilitated. If that fear doesn't overcome your urge to make the wrong decisions, then you'll make the wrong decisions. You see, the primary function of fear is to be a motivating factor, not a debilitating factor. Fear is the impetus that compels you to get out of a dangerous situation. There's a contradiction in the Western world. You see, in modern society, marketers will exploit our fears to sell us solutions in order to achieve greater status and better relationships. This type of marketing is viewed as completely socially acceptable. However, it's viewed as taboo to fear for our own personal well-being and get prepared for what we likely know are inevitable disasters. In fact, it's a practice that's oftentimes associated with mental illness. From my point of view, preparedness is not just about preparing for the bad times and disasters. In fact, it's about becoming a better, more well-rounded individual. You see, preparedness is just insurance. It provides you with peace of mind. Most people are perfectly content spending hundreds of thousands of dollars on various types of insurance throughout their lifetime. More often than not, you're never going to see any of that money again. So why the persistent stigma within society about storing a few weeks' worth of food? There's something called optimistic bias, and it's commonly defined as the mistaken belief that one's chances of experiencing a negative event are lower than that of one's peers. So if we know what all the risk factors are, and that the world's possibly on the brink of a disaster, is it not irrational to be more optimistic? Nor should one be pessimistic, but rather we should aspire to be stoic in the face of monumental challenges. In our modern world, rational fear for self-preservation has been stigmatized. The question is, why has it been stigmatized? Is it because self-reliant individuals are more challenging to regulate? Let's face it, if you're self-reliant, it's a lot harder for the government to control everything you say, think, and do. So we've established that the irrational fears are what tend to be weaponized against us. Things like fear of how you look, fear of not being accepted by others, fear of not keeping up with the Joneses. But heaven forbid you fear the collapse of Western civilization. Now, I will say that prepping does become irrational when you become part of the problem. Maybe you start to engender antisocial behaviors. Maybe your preparedness isn't proportional to the actual threat. Any obsession can become an unhealthy addiction to the point in which it is irrational. So, our old friend Thomas Malthus believed that human population would invariably collapse under its own weight. Up until this point, he's been proven wrong. However, all of the threats that we've discussed here today, these are potential crises that not even the cynicism of old Malthus could foresee. So remember, you have everything to gain being preparedness-minded and nothing to lose. Time is of the essence, so keep on prepping. Thanks for watching. Canadian Prepper out.
The best way to support this channel is to support yourself by gearing up at CanadianPreparedness.com, where you'll find high-quality survival gear at the best prices, no junk, and no gimmicks. Use discount code PREPPINGGEAR for 10% off. Don't forget, the strong survive, but the prepared thrive. Stay safe.